In a crowded bar filled with weekend warriors and college students, a decorated Marine made the biggest mistake of his military career. He didn't fire at the wrong target or miss an important briefing. Instead, he shoved a woman he thought was just another civilian getting in his way. What he didn't know was that this woman commanded more naval vessels than he had ever seen, led thousands of sailors across multiple fleets, and held a rank that could end his career with a single phone call. This is the story of Admiral Sarah Chun, a woman who rose through the ranks when female naval officers were still fighting for respect, and Marine Sergeant Jake Morrison, whose split-second decision at Murphy's Bar would teach him the most important lesson about respect, assumptions, and the true meaning of leadership. Sometimes the most powerful people in a room are the ones you least expect. The bass from a jukebox thumped through Murphy's Bar as Saturday night reached its peak. Located just outside Naval Base Norfolk, Murphy's had become the unofficial gathering spot for service members looking to unwind after a long week. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, laughter, and the clinking of beer bottles. Neon signs advertising various beer brands cast colorful shadows across the worn wooden floors, and the smell of fried food mixed with the distinct aroma of spilled beer that had soaked into the floorboards over decades. Marine Sergeant Jake Morrison pushed through the crowd, his broad shoulders cutting a path toward the bar. At 26, Jake had already served 2 tours in Afghanistan and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had faced real danger. His buzz cut was regulation perfect, and even in civilian clothes, his military bearing was unmistakable. The black t-shirt stretched tight across his chest bore the Marine Corps emblem, and his jeans were pressed with military precision. Tonight was supposed to be his celebration. After months of paperwork and interviews, he had finally received orders for Marine security guard duty at the American Embassy in London. It was a prestigious assignment, one that would advance his career significantly. Jake had been drinking since 6 in the evening, and the alcohol was making him more aggressive than usual. He had started with beer, but switched to whiskey shots around 9, celebrating with his fellow Marines who kept buying rounds. His usual discipline was slipping, replaced by an arrogance that the alcohol amplified. In his mind, he had earned the right to celebrate hard. He was a Marine, a warrior, someone who had bled for his country. Everyone else in this bar was just playing pretend soldier. The woman standing at the bar was petite, maybe 5 feet 4 inches tall, with short black hair, and wearing a simple blue button-down shirt and khakis. Nothing about her appearance screamed military to Jake's alcohol-clouded judgment. She looked like any other civilian, probably some college student or local resident who had wandered in from the nearby shopping district. Her back was to him as she waited to order, and Jake could see she was holding what appeared to be a small notebook, occasionally writing something down. Admiral Sarah Chun had stopped at Murphy's for a very different reason than the celebrating Marines. At 42, she was one of the youngest admirals in naval history and commanded the Atlantic Fleet's Carrier Strike Group. Her promotion to Rear Admiral had come just 6 months earlier, making her one of only a handful of female flag officers in the Navy. Tonight, she was conducting what she called her ground truth inspections, visiting places where her sailors spent their off-duty time to better understand their lives outside the military structure. Sarah had grown up in a military family. Her father was a Navy captain who served during Vietnam, and her mother was a Navy nurse who had broken barriers of her own. From childhood, Sarah had been surrounded by naval tradition, but she had also witnessed firsthand the challenges faced by women in the military. Her path to admiral had not been easy. She had endured countless instances of being underestimated, overlooked, and having to prove herself repeatedly in ways her male colleagues never had to. After graduating from the Naval Academy in 1998, Sarah had served on destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. She had commanded a destroyer during anti-piracy operations off Somalia, and later led a cruiser squadron during freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. Her tactical brilliance and calm leadership under pressure had earned respect throughout the Navy, but she had never forgotten what it felt like to be dismissed because of her appearance. Tonight at Murphy's, She was observing how her sailors interacted when they thought no officers were around. She had learned to dress down and blend in during these informal inspections. The notebook in her hand contained observations about morale, behavior patterns, and potential issues that might not surface through official channels. She had already noted that the Marines seemed more intoxicated than the sailors, and there appeared to be some tension building between different groups. Jake reached the bar area where Sarah was standing and immediately felt irritated. The space was crowded, and people were 3 deep trying to get the bartender's attention. He had been drinking for hours, and his patience was gone. In his mind, he deserved to be served before anyone else. He was a Marine, a real warrior, not some civilian taking up space at a military bar. "Move," Jake said loudly, his voice carrying the commanding tone he used with junior Marines. When Sarah didn't immediately respond, he became more aggressive. "I said move. You're in my way." Sarah heard the demand, but chose to ignore it. She had dealt with drunk service members before, and the best approach was usually to avoid confrontation. She continued waiting for the bartender, making a mental note about the need for better alcohol management training. Jake's alcohol-fueled arrogance reached a boiling point. Without warning, he placed his large hand on Sarah's shoulder and shoved her roughly to the side. The force of the push was significant enough to make her stumble, and she had to grab the edge of the bar to keep from falling completely. "I told you to move, lady," Jake said, his voice now loud enough to draw attention from nearby patrons. "This isn't a place for civilians anyway." The bar suddenly became quieter as conversation stopped and heads turned toward the confrontation. Several Marines who had been drinking with Jake looked uncomfortable, sensing that their friend had crossed the line. The bartender, a former Navy petty officer named Mike who had been working at Murphy's for 15 years, immediately recognized that something serious was about to happen. Sarah straightened herself and turned to face Jake for the first time. Her expression was calm, but her dark eyes were sharp with intelligence and barely controlled anger. She had been pushed around literally and figuratively throughout her career, but never quite so blatantly or publicly. The physical assault was unacceptable, but what bothered her more was Jake's assumption that she didn't belong there, that her service and sacrifice were somehow less valid than his. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice steady and controlled despite the situation. "I think you've made a mistake." Jake looked down at her with obvious disdain. The alcohol had convinced him that he was completely in the right. This small woman was exactly the kind of person who didn't understand what real military service meant. She probably worked some desk job at the base or was married to someone in the Navy. Either way, she had no business taking up space where real warriors gathered. "No mistake, sweetheart," Jake replied, the condescending tone obvious to everyone within hearing distance. "You're in a military bar where actual service members come to drink. Maybe you should find somewhere else to hang out." Several sailors who had been sitting at nearby tables began to pay closer attention to the scene unfolding. Something about the woman seemed familiar to a few of them, but they couldn't quite place where they had seen her before. Her bearing was too confident, too comfortable in the military environment to be a random civilian. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her military identification card. She held it up so that Jake could see it clearly, though his vision was too blurred by alcohol to read the details properly. What he could see was that it was definitely a military ID, which surprised him but didn't change his aggressive attitude. "I am actual military," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm, but carrying an undertone of authority that made some of the more sober patrons straighten up instinctively. "And I have just as much right to be here as you do." Jake squinted at the ID card, but couldn't make out the specific details. His pride was now fully engaged, and the alcohol made it impossible for him to back down gracefully. In his mind, this woman might be military, but she was clearly some low-ranking clerk or administrative person. Real warriors were obvious, and she definitely didn't look like someone who had ever seen combat or held any real responsibility. "Yeah, right." Jake laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Let me guess, you're some Navy yeoman or maybe a cook." That's not real military, honey. When you've been shot at in Afghanistan like I have, then you can talk to me about being military. The silence in the immediate area was now complete. Even the jukebox seemed quieter as Jake's words hung in the air. Several Navy petty officers exchanged glances, and one of them pulled out his phone to quickly search something online. The bartender Mike was already reaching for the phone to call the shore patrol, sensing that this situation was about to explode. Sarah looked around the bar and noticed that several people were now watching intently. Some appeared to be recognizing her, and she could see phones being pulled out. She realized that this confrontation was quickly becoming a public incident that could have serious implications for everyone involved. "Sergeant Morrison," Sarah said, reading his name from the tags hanging around his neck. "I think you should sit down and have some coffee." The use of his rank and name sobered Jake slightly, but not enough to overcome his arrogance. He was impressed that she had identified his rank correctly, but that just proved she was familiar with military culture, not that she was anyone important herself. "How about you worry about yourself, lady?" Jake replied, his voice getting louder again. "I've earned the right to drink here. You can go find some civilian bar where you belong." One of the Navy petty officers who had been watching finally recognized Sarah from recent base communications. His face went pale as he realized what was happening. He quickly got up from his table and started moving toward the confrontation, knowing he needed to intervene before the situation became even worse. "Sir," the petty officer said, addressing Jake carefully, "I really think you should step back and mind your own business, Squid." Jake cut him off, using the derogatory term Marines often applied to Navy personnel. "This doesn't concern you." Sarah watched the interaction with growing concern. This wasn't just about her anymore. Jake's behavior was reflecting poorly on the entire Marine Corps, and his attitude toward the Navy petty officer who had tried to help showed a serious lack of respect for joint service cooperation. "Sergeant Morrison," Sarah said again, her voice now carrying unmistakable command authority, "you are creating a public disturbance, showing disrespect to fellow service members, and physically assaulted a superior officer. I strongly suggest you reconsider your current course of action." Jake heard the words superior officer and laughed loudly, the sound drawing even more attention from around the bar. In his alcohol-influenced thinking, there was no way this small woman could outrank him. He was a Marine sergeant with combat experience and decorated service. She was clearly bluffing or delusional. "Superior officer?" Jake repeated mockingly. "You're dreaming, lady. What are you, maybe a lieutenant? I've got more time in the chow line than you have in service." The Navy petty officer who had approached tried one more time to intervene. "Sir, please, you really need to listen to her." She's what?" Jake demanded, turning his aggressive attention to the sailor. "Some boot lieutenant who thinks her shiny new bars make her important? I was fighting Taliban when she was probably still in college." Mike the bartender had finished his call to shore patrol and was now trying to get closer to the situation. He had seen enough confrontations over the years to know when things were about to turn violent, and this had all the signs. The Marine was drunk, aggressive, and had already pushed the woman once. If he did it again, there would likely be a full-scale brawl. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She reached into her wallet and pulled out her active duty military identification card again, but this time she held it up so that everyone in the immediate area could see it clearly. The card identified her as Rear Admiral Sarah Chun, United States Navy, with a security clearance level that most of the people in the bar had never even heard of. The Navy petty officer who had been trying to intervene saw the card first and immediately snapped to attention. His sudden change in posture caught the attention of other sailors in the area, who began looking more closely at what was happening. Within seconds, several other Navy personnel recognized the name and rank on the identification card. "Oh no," one of the sailors whispered, the sound carrying clearly in the now silent section of the bar. "That's Admiral Chun. That's the Admiral Chun." Jake was still too drunk to process what was happening around him. He saw the sailors' reactions, but interpreted them as support for his position rather than recognition of their mistake. In his mind, they were finally realizing that he was a real warrior who deserved respect. "See," Jake said triumphantly, swaying slightly as the alcohol continued to affect his balance. "Even your Navy buddies know I'm right. You don't belong here with real military." Sarah looked around at the faces now staring at her with a mixture of recognition and horror. She realized that the situation had moved beyond a simple confrontation between two service members. This was now a very public incident involving a flag officer and a drunk Marine who had no idea what he had done. The shore patrol would arrive soon, and there would be official reports, investigations, and consequences. Jake's career was likely over, though he didn't know it yet. But more importantly, this incident would reflect on both the Marine Corps and Navy, potentially damaging relationships between the services and undermining public confidence in military professionalism. Sarah made another decision that would prove to be crucial. Instead of escalating the situation or pulling rank in a way that would humiliate Jake publicly, she chose a different approach. She put her identification away and spoke quietly to the Navy petty officer who had tried to help. "Please escort Sergeant Morrison to a table and make sure he gets some coffee," she said, her voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "I'll handle the rest." The petty officer nodded immediately and moved to comply, but Jake was not finished with his performance. The alcohol had convinced him that he had won the confrontation and that everyone now understood his superior position. "That's right," Jake said loudly, addressing the entire bar. "Real Marines don't back down from anyone. This lady learned her lesson about trying to intimidate someone who's actually served their country." Those words would be the ones that Jake would remember most clearly when he sobered up. They would haunt him for years to come, representing the moment when his arrogance and prejudice had blinded him to reality so completely that he had humiliated himself in the most public way possible. But that realization was still hours away. For now, Jake was still riding high on alcohol and false confidence, completely unaware that he had just physically assaulted and verbally abused one of the most powerful people in the United States Navy, someone who commanded more ships and personnel than he had ever imagined possible. The night was far from over, and the real consequences were just beginning. The shore patrol arrived at Murphy's bar 15 minutes after Mike's phone call, their black and white vehicle pulling up outside with red and blue lights flashing. Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez and Lance Corporal Williams stepped through the front door, immediately scanning the crowded room for signs of trouble. Both were experienced military police who had responded to countless bar fights, domestic disputes, and alcohol-related incidents over their careers. Rodriguez, a 10-year Navy veteran with a stocky build and graying temples, took the lead as they moved through the crowd. Williams, younger and taller with the typical Marine bearing, followed closely behind. They had worked together many times before and had developed an efficient system for handling these situations. The goal was always to de-escalate quickly and remove any troublemakers before situations spiraled out of control. What they found at Murphy's was unlike anything either had encountered before. Instead of the usual chaotic bar fight scene, they discovered an eerily quiet crowd surrounding what appeared to be a confrontation between a drunk Marine and a small Asian woman. Several Navy personnel were standing at attention, which was unusual for an off-duty environment, and everyone seemed to be waiting for something to happen. Jake was still standing near the bar, swaying slightly and holding a half-empty beer bottle. The alcohol had made him even more belligerent, and he was now loudly explaining to anyone who would listen how he had put some fake military wannabe in her place. His voice carried clearly across the room as he detailed his Afghanistan service and questioned why civilians were allowed in military establishments. "That woman there," Jake said, pointing unsteadily at Sarah, who was now sitting quietly at a corner table, tried to act like she was some kind of officer. Can you believe that? Probably never been outside Norfolk in her life. Tried to intimidate a real Marine who's actually been shot at. Rodriguez immediately recognized the signs of severe alcohol intoxication and potential assault charges. He approached Jake carefully keeping his hands visible and his voice calm. Williams moved to secure the perimeter and began quietly asking witnesses what had happened. "Good evening, Sergeant," Rodriguez said, reading Jake's name tape. "I'm Petty Officer Rodriguez, Shore Patrol. We received a call about a disturbance. Can you tell me what's going on here?" Jake's face lit up with what he thought was vindication. Finally, someone in authority had arrived to sort out this mess. In his alcohol-clouded thinking, the Shore Patrol would obviously side with him once they understood that he was a decorated Marine dealing with some civilian troublemaker. "About time he got here," Jake said loudly. "That woman over there assaulted me, and then tried to claim she was military. I had to defend myself and put her in her place. She's probably some base groupie or dependent wife who thinks she can push around real service members." Rodriguez exchanged a quick glance with Williams. Something about this story didn't add up. The woman Jake was pointing to was sitting calmly at a table, showing no signs of aggression or intoxication. Meanwhile, Jake was clearly drunk and exhibiting all the classic signs of someone who had been the aggressor in a confrontation. "Sir, can you describe exactly what happened?" Rodriguez asked, pulling out his incident report pad. "Start from the beginning." Jake launched into an elaborate and increasingly incoherent account of how he had been minding his own business when this woman had tried to intimidate him. According to his version, she had blocked his access to the bar, refused to move when he politely asked, and then claimed to be some kind of high-ranking officer when he called her out on her behavior. She even had some fake military ID. Jake continued, his voice getting louder. "Probably bought it online or something. Real military don't look like her, you know what I mean? She's too small, too soft. Never spent a day in the real military." Williams had been quietly interviewing witnesses and was getting a very different story. Multiple sailors and even some Marines had observed Jake push the woman aggressively and verbally abuse her when she tried to identify herself as military personnel. Several people mentioned that the woman had handled herself with remarkable calm and professionalism despite the provocation. More concerning to Williams was the reaction of the Navy personnel present. 3 different petty officers had quietly informed him that the woman was definitely active-duty military, though they seemed reluctant to provide specific details. Their body language suggested they knew more than they were saying, and their obvious nervousness indicated the situation was more serious than a typical bar fight. Rodriguez was beginning to piece together the real story when Mike the bartender approached him with additional information. As a veteran himself, Mike had a good relationship with the Shore Patrol and had provided crucial witness testimony in previous incidents. "Officer Rodriguez," Mike said quietly, "I think you need to know that the woman is definitely military. I've seen enough service members over the years to recognize bearing and presence. That Marine pushed her hard enough that she almost fell, and she never lost her composure. That's not normal civilian behavior." "Did you see any identification?" Rodriguez asked. "She showed him her military ID twice," Mike replied. "He was too drunk to read it properly, but I could see it was definitely official. The thing is, some of the Navy guys here seem to recognize her, and they're acting like she's someone really important." Rodriguez decided it was time to speak directly with the woman. He approached Sarah's table where she was sitting with her notebook, still occasionally writing observations about the evening's events. Up close, he could see the quiet confidence and alert awareness that marked career military personnel. "Ma'am, I'm Petty Officer Rodriguez with Shore Patrol. Could I speak with you about tonight's incident?" Sarah looked up from her notebook, and Rodriguez immediately noticed the intelligence in her eyes and the way she carried herself. Everything about her demeanor suggested someone accustomed to command and comfortable with authority. "Of course, Petty Officer," Sarah replied. "I'm Admiral Sarah Chun, commanding the Atlantic Fleet Carrier Strike Group. Here's my identification." Rodriguez took the military ID card, and his hands began to tremble slightly as he read the details. Rear Admiral Sarah Chun, with a security clearance higher than his own and command authority over thousands of personnel. He had been expecting to find a junior officer or enlisted personnel, not a flag officer who technically outranked nearly everyone on the entire base. "Admiral, I had no idea," Rodriguez stammered, immediately coming to attention. "Can you please tell me exactly what happened tonight?" Sarah's account was precise and factual, delivered in the calm, professional tone of someone who had briefed senior officials countless times. She described Jake's aggressive demands, the physical assault when he pushed her, and his continued verbal abuse even after she identified herself as military personnel. She was careful to stick to observable facts and avoided any editorial comments about Jake's character or motivations. "The sergeant appears to be severely intoxicated," Sarah concluded. "His behavior reflects poorly on the Marine Corps and demonstrates a serious lack of judgment and professionalism. However, I believe this situation can be resolved through appropriate disciplinary channels without requiring civilian law enforcement involvement." Rodriguez was now in a state of barely controlled panic. He had responded to what he thought was a routine bar fight, and instead found himself dealing with an assault on a flag officer. The paperwork alone would be enormous, but the potential consequences for his own career if he mishandled the situation were terrifying. Williams approached after finishing his witness interviews, and Rodriguez quickly briefed him on Sarah's identity. The young Marine's face went white as he realized the magnitude of what had occurred. In Marine culture, showing disrespect to any superior officer was serious, but assaulting a flag officer was career-ending and potentially criminal. "What do you want us to do, Admiral?" Rodriguez asked, his voice reflecting the gravity of the situation. Sarah considered her options carefully. She could press full charges, which would result in Jake facing court-martial proceedings and likely imprisonment. She could demand his immediate arrest and removal from service. She had the authority to destroy his career with a single phone call. But she also understood that this incident reflected broader issues within military culture that wouldn't be solved by severely punishing one drunk Marine. "I want Sergeant Morrison removed from the premises immediately," Sarah said. "He needs to sober up and then report to his commanding officer first thing Monday morning. There will be an official incident report, and appropriate disciplinary action will be taken through his chain of command. But I believe this can be handled as a military matter rather than a civilian crime." Rodriguez nodded gratefully, recognizing that Sarah was showing remarkable restraint given the circumstances. Many officers would have demanded the harshest possible punishment for such blatant disrespect and assault. Her measured response suggested someone more concerned with justice than revenge. Williams moved to inform Jake that he was being removed from the premises, but Jake's reaction made the situation even worse. The alcohol had convinced him that the arrival of shore patrol proved he was in the right, and he assumed they were there to arrest the woman who had assaulted him. Finally, Jake exclaimed loudly as Williams approached, "I told you that woman was trouble. Are you going to arrest her for trying to intimidate me? And for having fake military identification? That's probably a federal crime or something." Williams tried to speak quietly to avoid drawing more attention, but Jake's voice carried across the entire bar. "Sir, you need to come with us. You're being removed from the premises for public intoxication and assault." "Assault?" Jake laughed loudly. "I'm the one who was assaulted. That woman tried to claim she was some kind of admiral or something. Can you believe that? An admiral? She probably doesn't even know what an admiral does." The irony of Jake's words was not lost on anyone within hearing distance. Several sailors exchanged horrified glances, realizing that Jake was digging himself deeper with every word. The fact that he was mocking the very idea of Sarah being an admiral while she sat just 20 feet away made the situation almost surreal. "Sir, please lower your voice and come with me," Williams said firmly. "We'll discuss this outside." But Jake was not finished humiliating himself. The alcohol had removed all his normal filters, and his arrogance was now on full display for everyone to witness. He turned to address the entire bar, raising his beer bottle like he was making a toast. "Let this be a lesson to everyone," Jake announced loudly. "Real Marines don't back down from anyone, especially fake officers who think they can intimidate us with bogus credentials. I've been shot at in Afghanistan, and I'm not afraid of some woman pretending to be military." The silence that followed Jake's speech was deafening. Even the jukebox seemed to have stopped playing. Sarah continued writing in her notebook, documenting Jake's behavior for the official report that would follow. Her calm reaction to his continued insults demonstrated a level of professionalism that impressed everyone watching. Rodriguez decided that the situation required immediate action before Jake said something even more damaging. He approached Jake directly and spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear clearly. "Sergeant Morrison, you are under arrest for assault on a superior officer, conduct unbecoming, and public intoxication. The woman you assaulted is Rear Admiral Sarah Chun of the United States Navy. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right immediately." The effect of Rodriguez's words was like a physical blow. Jake's face went through a series of expressions as the information slowly penetrated his alcohol-clouded brain. Confusion gave way to disbelief, then to dawning horror as he began to understand what he had done. "That's not possible," Jake whispered, his voice suddenly much quieter. "She can't be an admiral. She's too young, too small. Admirals are old men with gray hair and medals. Admiral Chun is 42 years old and one of the youngest flag officers in naval history," Rodriguez explained, his voice carrying clearly across the silent bar. "She commands the Atlantic Fleet Carrier Strike Group, which includes multiple aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers, and submarines. She has authority over approximately 30,000 personnel." Jake's beer bottle slipped from his suddenly numb fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent room. His face had gone completely pale, and he was swaying more noticeably as the full impact of the situation hit him. "But she doesn't look like an admiral," Jake said weakly, his voice now barely audible. "How was I supposed to know? Perhaps you might have listened when she identified herself," Williams said dryly. "Multiple witnesses report that Admiral Chin showed you her military identification twice and clearly stated her rank and position." The reality of a situation was beginning to penetrate even Jake's alcohol-impaired thinking. He had physically assaulted a flag officer, one of the highest-ranking people in the entire military. He had mocked her service, questioned her credentials, and done it all in public with dozens of witnesses. His career was not just over. He would likely face court-martial and possible imprisonment. "I want to apologize," Jake said suddenly, turning towards Sarah's table. "Admiral, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I was drunk and stupid, and I'm sorry." Sarah looked up from her notebook and studied Jake's face for several seconds before responding. She could see the genuine remorse beginning to emerge as the alcohol wore off and reality set in. But she also knew that this apology was motivated more by fear of consequences than by real understanding of what he had done wrong. "Your apology is noted, Sergeant Morrison," Sarah said calmly. "However, this incident raises serious questions about your judgment, your respect for fellow service members, and your understanding of military values. These issues will need to be addressed through appropriate channels." Rodriguez and Williams moved to escort Jake from the bar, but he resisted slightly, apparently wanting to continue apologizing or explaining himself. The alcohol was still affecting his coordination, and he stumbled as they guided him toward the door. "Please, Admiral," Jake called over his shoulder as they led him away. "I have orders to London. I'm supposed to be Marine security guard at the embassy. This was all just a big mistake." Sarah watched them leave without changing expression, but she made another note in her book. The fact that Jake was scheduled for embassy duty made his behavior even more concerning. Marine security guards represented the United States overseas and needed to demonstrate the highest standards of professionalism and cultural sensitivity. Someone who would assault a superior officer based on assumptions about gender and appearance was clearly not suitable for such a position. As the shore patrol vehicle drove away with Jake in the back seat, the bar slowly began to return to normal conversation levels. Several sailors approached Sarah's table, apparently wanting to introduce themselves or express their support. But she politely indicated that she preferred to be left alone to finish her observations. The incident at Murphy's bar was over, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold. Jake would spend the night in the base detention facility, sobering up and beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Sarah would return to her quarters and begin preparing the official report that would end his Marine Corps career and likely result in criminal charges. But both of them would carry the memory of this night for the rest of their lives, for very different reasons. Jake Morrison woke up in a cold, gray detention cell at Naval Base Norfolk at 6:30 Monday morning with the worst hangover of his life and a growing sense of dread about what had happened Saturday night. The memories were coming back in painful fragments, like pieces of broken glass cutting through the fog in his brain. He remembered drinking heavily at Murphy's bar. He remembered celebrating his upcoming assignment to London. But most clearly, he remembered pushing a small woman and calling her a fake officer. The detention cell was standard military issue. A narrow bunk with a thin mattress, a metal toilet, and sink combination, and fluorescent lights that buzzed constantly overhead. Jake had been in similar cells before during his early Marine Corps years when he had gotten into fights or violated curfew, but this felt different. The weight of genuine fear pressed down on his chest as more details from Saturday night surfaced in his memory. He remembered shore patrol arriving and someone mentioning the word admiral. At first, he had thought they were joking or trying to scare him. But as he lay on the hard bunk staring at the ceiling, Jake was beginning to accept that something catastrophic had happened to his career and his life. Petty Officer Rodriguez appeared at the cell door at 7 o'clock sharp, carrying a clipboard and wearing the serious expression of someone delivering bad news. Jake sat up immediately, his military training overriding his hangover and anxiety. Despite everything that had happened, he still respected the authority structure and knew better than to remain lying down when an officer approached. "Sergeant Morrison," Rodriguez said formally, "you're being released to your commanding officer this morning. Colonel Harrison will be here at 0800 to escort you to your unit. You need a shower, get into your dress blue uniform, and prepare for what's going to be a very serious conversation." Jake's stomach dropped at the mention of dress blues. In the Marine Corps, dress blue uniforms were reserved for ceremonies, court appearances, and other formal occasions. Being ordered to wear dress blues for a meeting with your commanding officer was never a good sign. It meant the situation was serious enough to require maximum military formality. "Petty Officer Rodriguez," Jake said carefully, "what exactly am I being charged with?" Rodriguez consulted his clipboard before answering. "Assault on a superior officer, conduct unbecoming a Marine, public intoxication, and disrespect toward a flag officer. The preliminary charges have been filed, and there will likely be additional charges depending on the investigation results." The words hit Jake like physical blows. Assault on a superior officer was a court-martial offense that could result in years of imprisonment. Conduct unbecoming could end his career even if the other charges were dropped. And disrespect toward a flag officer was something that the military took extremely seriously, especially in the current political climate where military professionalism was under constant public scrutiny. "How bad is this?" Jake asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. Rodriguez studied Jake's face for several seconds before responding. Despite his professional obligations, he felt some sympathy for the young Marine who was clearly beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistakes. "Sergeant, you physically assaulted Rear Admiral Sarah Chun, one of the most respected and powerful officers in the United States Navy. You did it in public, in front of dozens of witnesses, while she was conducting official business. Then, you spent 20 minutes verbally abusing her and questioning her credentials while she showed remarkable restraint. This is about as bad as it gets without actually striking a flag officer with your fist." Jake felt like he was going to vomit. The partial memories he had been hoping were alcohol-induced nightmares were apparently all too real. He had not only assaulted a superior officer, but he had done it to an admiral, someone whose authority extended far beyond his own unit or even his own service branch. "What's going to happen to me?" Jake whispered. "That's not my decision to make," Rodriguez replied. "But I can tell you that Admiral Chun could have had you arrested for felony assault. She could have demanded immediate court-martial proceedings. Instead, she chose to handle this through military channels, which suggests she's more interested in justice than revenge. That's probably the only reason you're not facing civilian criminal charges right now." After Rodriguez left, Jake was alone with his thoughts and his growing fear. He tried to remember everything he could about Saturday night, hoping to find some detail that might mitigate the situation. But every memory made things worse. He remembered calling Admiral Chun a fake officer. He remembered questioning whether she had ever served outside Norfolk. Most damaging, he remembered his final speech to the entire bar about how real Marines don't back down from fake officers. The shower facilities in the detention center were Spartan, but functional. Jake stood under the hot water for 20 minutes, trying to wash away both his hangover and his shame. The physical assault was bad enough, but what bothered him most was how completely wrong he had been about Admiral Chun. His assumptions about what a military officer should look like had blinded him to obvious signs of her experience and authority. Getting into his dress blue uniform felt like putting on his own funeral clothes. The Marine dress blue uniform was one of the most recognizable and respected military uniforms in the world, with its distinctive high collar, gold buttons, and blood stripe down the trouser leg. Jake had always felt pride when wearing it, but today it felt like a costume for his own court-martial. Colonel Harrison arrived at exactly 8 o'clock, accompanied by Captain Williams, the unit's executive officer, and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Jake's immediate supervisor. Colonel Harrison was a career Marine with 22 years of service, including multiple combat deployments, and a reputation for being tough but fair. His expression this morning suggested that fairness might be in short supply. "Sergeant Morrison," Colonel Harrison said without any preliminary greeting, "you are in more trouble than any Marine I have ever encountered in my entire career. The only reason you are not currently in a federal prison is because Admiral Chun chose to show you mercy that you absolutely do not deserve." Jake stood at rigid attention, afraid to speak or even breathe loudly. Colonel Harrison's voice carried the cold anger of someone who was personally offended by what had occurred. In Marine culture, honor and respect for authority were fundamental values, and Jake's behavior had violated both in the most public way possible. "Sir, I want to apologize," Jake began. "You will speak when spoken to." Colonel Harrison cut him off sharply. "Right now, you will listen while I explain exactly how badly you have damaged not only your own career, but also the reputation of this unit, the Marine Corps, and military professionalism in general." The ride to the Marine Corps headquarters building was conducted in complete silence. Jake sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the familiar base buildings, wondering if this would be the last time he saw them as an active-duty Marine. His assignment to London was obviously canceled, but that was the least of his problems now. The headquarters building was an imposing structure that housed the commanding officers for all Marine units stationed at Norfolk. Jake had been there before for promotion ceremonies and unit briefings, but never under circumstances like these. Today, the building felt like a courthouse where his future would be decided. They were escorted to Conference Room B, a formal meeting space with a long mahogany table, portraits of Marine heroes on the walls, and an American flag in the corner. Already seated at the table were several officers Jake didn't recognize, along with a civilian in a business suit who was apparently a military attorney. Colonel Harrison took his seat at the head of the table and gestured for Jake to remain standing. The formal arrangement made it clear that this was not a discussion among equals, but rather a military tribunal where Jake's fate would be determined. "Sergeant Morrison," Colonel Harrison began, "present in this room are representatives from Admiral Chen's staff, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, the Base Legal Office, and your own chain of command. We are here to determine how to proceed with the most serious incident involving a Marine and a flag officer that any of us have ever encountered. Jake's legs felt weak as the full scope of the situation became clear. NCIS involvement meant there would be a federal investigation. Legal office presence meant court-martial proceedings were being considered, and Admiral Chin's staff was there to ensure that the Navy's interests were protected throughout the process. Commander Sarah Mitchell, Admiral Chin's chief of staff, spoke first. She was a sharp-featured woman in her late 30s with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with serious military matters. Sergeant Morrison, Commander Mitchell said, Admiral Chun has reviewed the preliminary incident report and witness statements. She has also watched security camera footage from Murphy's Bar that clearly shows you physically assaulting her and subsequently verbally abusing her for approximately 20 minutes. Jake felt his knees buckle slightly. He had not considered that the bar might have security cameras. Video evidence would make it impossible to claim the assault was accidental or that his words had been misunderstood. However, Commander Mitchell continued, Admiral Chun has instructed me to offer you an alternative to full court-martial proceedings, provided you meet certain conditions. For the first time since Saturday night, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. If Admiral Chun was willing to consider alternatives to court-martial, perhaps his career could still be salvaged somehow. The Admiral's offer is as follows, Commander Mitchell explained, reading from an official document. You will accept non-judicial punishment under Article 15 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You will be reduced in rank to Lance Corporal. You will forfeit 2 months' pay. You will perform 90 days of extra duty. Your assignment to London is permanently canceled. And you will undergo mandatory counseling for alcohol abuse and sensitivity training regarding military diversity and inclusion. Jake's initial relief was tempered by the realization that these punishments were still career-ending. A reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and cancellation of a prestigious assignment would follow him for the rest of his military service. But, compared to years in military prison, Admiral Chin's offer was remarkably generous. In addition, Commander Mitchell continued, you will personally apologize to Admiral Chun in writing, explaining what you learned from this incident and how you plan to prevent similar behavior in the future. This apology will be reviewed by Admiral Chun personally and must demonstrate genuine understanding of your mistakes. The military attorney leaned forward to address Jake directly. Sergeant, I need to make sure you understand your options here. If you refuse Admiral Chin's offer, you will face general court-martial on charges of assault, conduct unbecoming, and disrespect. If convicted, you could face up to 5 years in military prison, dishonorable discharge, and loss of all veteran benefits. Admiral Chin's offer allows you to remain in the Marine Corps and eventually rebuild your career. Jake's mind was reeling as he tried to process everything he was hearing. Admiral Chun had every right to demand the harshest possible punishment, but instead she was offering him a chance to learn from his mistakes and continue serving. Her restraint and professionalism stood in stark contrast to his own behavior on Saturday night. I accept Admiral Chin's offer, Jake said immediately, and I want to thank her for showing me mercy I don't deserve. Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly. That's the first intelligent thing you've said since this whole incident began. But don't mistake Admiral Chin's mercy for weakness, Sergeant. She could have destroyed your life with a single phone call, and instead she chose to give you an opportunity to redeem yourself. I suggest you spend considerable time thinking about why she made that choice. The formal proceedings continued for another hour as paperwork was completed and Jake's punishment was officially documented. Throughout the process, he found himself thinking about Admiral Chun and trying to understand her motivations. She had been physically assaulted and publicly humiliated, yet she had chosen justice over revenge. As the meeting concluded, Commander Mitchell provided Jake with Admiral Chin's business address and instructions for submitting his written apology. Admiral Chun expects your letter within 72 hours, she said. It should be handwritten, not typed, and should demonstrate genuine reflection on your behavior and its consequences. Walking out of the headquarters building, Jake felt like a completely different person than he had been on Saturday night. His arrogance and prejudices had been stripped away, replaced by humility and a growing respect for the woman he had wronged. He had learned more about leadership, professionalism, and character in the past 3 days than in his entire previous military career. That evening, Jake sat at his desk in his barracks room with a pen and blank paper, trying to find words that could adequately express his remorse and gratitude. How do you apologize to someone for assaulting them based on assumptions about their appearance? How do you thank someone for showing mercy when they had every right to seek revenge? Outside his window, Jake could see ships moving in and out of Norfolk Harbor. Some of those ships were part of Admiral Chen's command, vessels that she was responsible for, and crews that looked to her for leadership. The scope of her authority and responsibility made his own position seem microscopic by comparison. But what impressed Jake most was not Admiral Chen's power, but her restraint. She had the authority to destroy his career and his life, yet she had chosen to teach him a lesson instead. Her response to his assault had demonstrated the kind of leadership that Jake was only beginning to understand. As he finally began writing his letter, Jake realized that Saturday night at Murphy's Bar had been the most important learning experience of his life. It had cost him his rank, his money, his prestigious assignment, and his pride. But it had also taught him about real leadership, genuine professionalism, and the difference between authority and authoritarianism. Admiral Sarachun had shown him what it really meant to be a leader. 6 months after the incident at Murphy's Bar, Jake Morrison stood at attention outside Admiral Chen's office aboard the USS George Washington, the flagship of the Atlantic Fleet Carrier Strike Group. He was wearing his dress blue uniform again, but this time the single chevron of a lance corporal reflected both his punishment and his ongoing journey toward redemption. The aircraft carrier was preparing for deployment to the Mediterranean, and Jake had specifically requested permission to speak with Admiral Chen before she departed. The intervening months had been the most challenging and educational of Jake's military career. His reduction in rank had been humiliating, but the mandatory counseling and sensitivity training had forced him to confront aspects of his character that he had never examined before. Dr. Patricia Williams, the base psychologist who had conducted his alcohol counseling, had helped him understand how his drinking had amplified existing prejudices and insecurities. The diversity and inclusion training had been particularly eye-opening. Jake learned about the history of women in the military, the challenges they faced, and the additional barriers that female officers encountered in advancing to senior positions. He discovered that Admiral Chen's rise to flag rank was even more remarkable than he had initially understood, achieved despite decades of systemic discrimination and cultural resistance. Jake had also used his time to research Admiral Chen's background and career in detail. What he found was a record of exceptional service that put his own achievements in perspective. She had graduated second in her class from the Naval Academy, served with distinction in multiple combat zones, and earned advanced degrees in international relations and strategic studies. Her commands had consistently achieved the highest readiness ratings, and her tactical innovations had been adopted throughout the fleet. More importantly, Jake learned about Admiral Chen's reputation for developing junior officers and caring for her personnel. Multiple articles in military publications describe her leadership style as demanding but supportive, with a particular talent for identifying potential in people that others had overlooked. Several officers credited her mentorship with saving their careers after serious mistakes. The letter Jake had written to Admiral Chen 6 months earlier had been the most difficult document he had ever composed. It had taken him 14 drafts to find words that adequately expressed his remorse while demonstrating genuine understanding of his mistakes. He had written about his assumptions and prejudices, his alcohol abuse, and his failure to recognize real leadership when he encountered it. To his surprise, Admiral Chen had responded personally to his letter. Her reply was brief but thoughtful, acknowledging his apology while challenging him to translate his understanding into meaningful action. She had also included reading recommendations about military history and leadership that had become Jake's focus during his punishment period. Now, standing outside her office, Jake was nervous but determined. He had requested this meeting to personally thank Admiral Chun for her mercy and to share what he had learned from the experience. But he also had a deeper purpose that he had been planning for months. "Admiral Chun will see you now," said Lieutenant Commander Davis, her aide-de-camp, gesturing toward the office door. Admiral Chin's office aboard the carrier was efficiently arranged, but personal, with family photos, unit citations, and maritime charts covering the walls. She was seated behind her desk reviewing deployment orders when Jake entered, and she gestured for him to take a seat across from her. "Lance Corporal Morrison," Admiral Chin said, using his reduced rank without any hint of mockery or condescension. "I understand you requested this meeting. What can I do for you?" Up close, Jake was struck again by Admiral Chin's quiet authority and professional bearing. She was wearing her working uniform with the Admiral's stars clearly visible, but her demeanor was approachable rather than intimidating. Everything about her presence reinforced the leadership lessons Jake had been learning. "Admiral, I wanted to thank you personally for your mercy 6 months ago." Jake began, his voice steady but respectful. "You had every right to end my career, but instead you gave me an opportunity to learn and grow. I don't think I'll ever fully understand why you made that choice, but I'm grateful for it every day." Admiral Chun studied Jake's face as he spoke, evaluating his sincerity and growth. She had seen many young service members make serious mistakes, and she had learned to distinguish between genuine remorse and self-serving apologies designed to minimize consequences. "Lance Corporal, I made that choice because I believed you were capable of learning from your mistakes," Admiral Chin replied. "Your behavior that night was unacceptable, but it seemed to stem from ignorance and poor judgment rather than malicious intent. I hoped that given the right consequences and education, you might become a better Marine and a better person." "Ma'am, I believe you were right," Jake said. "The past 6 months have been difficult, but they've also been the most educational period of my life. I've learned about leadership, about respect, about my own prejudices and assumptions. More importantly, I've learned to recognize real authority and professionalism when I see it." Admiral Chin nodded approvingly. She had read Jake's quarterly progress reports and had been impressed by his genuine commitment to self-improvement. His commanding officers reported that he had approached his punishment duties with dedication and had become a positive influence on younger Marines. "Admiral, I have something I'd like to share with you," Jake continued, reaching into his dress blue jacket to pull out a folded document. "With your permission, I'd like to read something I wrote for my Marine Corps leadership class." Admiral Chun gestured for him to proceed, curious about what Jake had prepared. Jake unfolded the paper and began reading in a clear, steady voice. "Leadership is not about commanding respect through intimidation or assumptions about authority. Real leadership is demonstrated through actions, decisions, and character, especially under pressure. 6 months ago, I learned this lesson in the most humiliating way possible when I assaulted a superior officer because she didn't match my narrow assumptions about what leadership should look like." He paused briefly before continuing. "Admiral Sarah Chun taught me that true authority comes from competence, integrity, and the strength to show mercy when you have every right to seek revenge. She could have ended my career with a single decision, but instead she chose to educate me about respect, professionalism, and the meaning of service. Her response to my assault demonstrated more about leadership than anything I had learned in 8 years of military service." Jake looked up from his paper to meet Admiral Chin's eyes before continuing. "I now understand that my behavior that night reflected not just alcohol impairment, but fundamental flaws in my character and understanding of military values. I judged a superior officer based on her appearance rather than her achievements. I allowed prejudice to blind me to obvious signs of competence and authority. Most shamefully, I physically assaulted someone who was conducting herself with perfect professionalism despite my provocation. Admiral Chun listened intently as Jake continued reading his essay, which detailed the specific lessons he had learned and the changes he had made to his behavior and attitudes. She was particularly impressed by his analysis of how cultural assumptions about gender and authority had influenced his actions. The most important lesson I learned, Jake concluded, is that real strength is demonstrated through restraint, not aggression. Admiral Chin showed more courage in choosing mercy over revenge than I showed in 2 tours of combat duty. She taught me that true leadership means building up others rather than tearing them down, even when those others have wronged you. Jake folded his paper and looked directly at Admiral Chun. "Ma'am, you saved my career and possibly my life that night. But more than that, you taught me what it really means to be a leader and a Marine. I wanted you to know that your decision to show me mercy has had consequences far beyond just my own development." "How so?" Admiral Chin asked, genuinely curious about Jake's meaning. "Admiral, I've been working with Dr. Williams to develop a training program for junior Marines about unconscious bias and assumptions about authority," Jake explained. "We're using my experience as a case study to help other Marines understand how prejudice can undermine military effectiveness and unit cohesion." Admiral Chun raised an eyebrow, clearly interested in this development. "Tell me more about this training program." Jake's face lit up with enthusiasm as he described the project he had been working on. "We start with the basic premise that effective military operations require accurate assessment of situations and personnel. When service members make assumptions based on appearance, gender, race, or other superficial characteristics, they can miss critical information and make dangerous mistakes. We use my assault on you as the primary example," Jake continued. "I completely failed to recognize a flag officer because she didn't match my preconceived notions about what admiral should look like. In a combat situation, that kind of failure could have catastrophic consequences for mission success and personnel safety." Admiral Chun was impressed by the sophistication of Jake's analysis and the constructive way he was using his experience. "Have you implemented this training yet?" "Yes, ma'am. We've conducted pilot sessions with 3 Marine units here at Norfolk. The feedback has been very positive, and Colonel Harrison has recommended the program for base-wide implementation. Dr. Williams thinks it could be adapted for use throughout the military." Jake paused before continuing with what was clearly the most important part of his message. "Admiral, none of this would have happened if you had simply had me court-martialed 6 months ago. Your decision to show mercy created an opportunity for education and growth that has benefited dozens of Marines beyond just myself." Admiral Chun sat back at her chair, considering Jake's words carefully. She had made the decision to offer alternative punishment based on her assessment of his potential for growth, but she had not anticipated that the lesson would extend beyond Jake himself. "Lance Corporal, I'm impressed by what you've accomplished," Admiral Chin said. "But I want you to understand that the real test of your growth will come over time in how you treat others when you think no one is watching. The lessons you've learned need to become permanent changes in your character, not just academic exercises." "Yes, ma'am, I understand that completely," Jake replied. "That's actually the other reason I requested this meeting. I wanted to ask if you would be willing to serve as a reference for my application to attend the Marine Corps Command and Staff College." Admiral Chun was surprised by the request. Command and Staff College was a highly competitive program that prepared Marines for senior leadership positions. For Jake to be considering such an application so soon after his punishment showed remarkable ambition and confidence. "Lance Corporal, you do realize that your recent disciplinary action will be part of your record when the selection board reviews your application?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm fully aware of that," Jake replied. "But I've learned that real leadership sometimes means acknowledging your mistakes publicly and demonstrating how you've grown from them. If the selection board believes that my experience has made me a better potential leader, then I'm willing to compete. If not, I'll accept their decision and continue serving to the best of my ability in whatever capacity the Marine Corps needs me." Admiral Chun studied Jake's face for several seconds, evaluating his sincerity and maturity. The young Marine who had assaulted her 6 months ago had been arrogant, prejudiced, and driven by alcohol and false pride. The person sitting across from her now demonstrated humility, self-awareness, and a sophisticated understanding of leadership principles. Lance Corporal Morrison, I will provide a reference for your application, Admiral Chun said finally. But I will be completely honest about both your mistakes and your growth. The selection board will know exactly what happened that night at Murphy's Bar, and they will also know how you responded to the consequences. Jake's face showed relief and gratitude. Admiral, that's all I can ask for. Honesty and fairness, which is exactly what you showed me 6 months ago. As the meeting concluded, Admiral Chun walked Jake to the door of her office. Before he left, she had one final observation to share. Lance Corporal, you asked earlier why I chose to show you mercy instead of seeking maximum punishment. I think you've answered that question through your actions over the past 6 months. I saw potential in you that night, even though you were behaving terribly. I believe that given the right consequences and guidance, you could become the kind of leader the Marine Corps needs. She paused before continuing. But the real reason I made that choice was because someone once showed similar mercy to me early in my career when I made a serious mistake. A senior officer looked past my error and saw my potential, just as I try to look past your behavior and see yours. That's what real leaders do. They build up the next generation rather than just punishing their failures. Jake stood at attention and rendered a perfect salute. Admiral, thank you for everything you've taught me. I hope someday I'll have the opportunity to show similar leadership when someone under my command makes a serious mistake. Admiral Chun returned the salute with a slight smile. Lance Corporal, based on what I've seen from you today, I believe you will. As Jake left the carrier and returned to his duties at Norfolk, he carried with him a deeper understanding of leadership than he had ever possessed before. The incident at Murphy's Bar had cost him his rank, his assignment, and his pride, but it had given him something far more valuable, a true appreciation for the difference between authority and authoritarianism, between strength and aggression, between punishment and justice. Admiral Chun watched from her office window as Jake's boat returned to shore. In a few hours, her carrier strike group would depart for the Mediterranean, where they would spend 6 months protecting American interests and maintaining peace through strength. But she took satisfaction in knowing that her brief encounter with a drunk Marine 6 months earlier might have a lasting impact on military culture and leadership development. The incident at Murphy's Bar had become something more than just a disciplinary matter. It had become a teaching moment that would continue to influence young Marines for years to come, demonstrating that true leadership sometimes means choosing education over punishment, growth over revenge, and hope over despair. 6 months later, Jake received notification that he had been selected for Command and Staff College. The selection board's comments noted his remarkable growth following a serious disciplinary incident and praised his innovative work on bias training programs. Admiral Chin's reference had been honest about his mistakes, but had also highlighted his potential for future leadership. On the day Jake was promoted back to sergeant, he wore his dress blue uniform with genuine pride for the first time since the night he had assaulted Admiral Chun. But now his pride was based not on arrogance or assumptions about his own superiority, but on the hard-earned knowledge that Real leadership means serving others, especially those who have wronged you. The lesson Admiral Chun had taught him at Murphy's Bar would guide his entire career, and eventually he would pass it on to the next generation of Marines who needed to learn the difference between commanding respect and earning it. 5 years after the incident at Murphy's Bar, Colonel Jake Morrison stood at the podium of the Marine Corps Command and Staff College, addressing a room filled with newly promoted captains and majors. The silver eagles on his collar reflected his remarkable rise through the ranks, a journey that had begun in the darkest moment of his career when he physically assaulted a flag officer. Today, he was delivering the opening lecture for a leadership course that had become mandatory throughout the Marine Corps. The auditorium was packed with Marine officers from across the globe, all eager to advance their careers and improve their leadership skills. Many of them had heard rumors about Colonel Morrison's background, whispered stories about a dramatic incident early in his career that had somehow led to his current position as one of the Marine Corps' most respected instructors on leadership and military ethics. "Good morning, Marines," Jake began, his voice carrying easily across the large room. "Before we begin our discussion about leadership principles, I want to tell you about the night I learned what real leadership looks like. It's a story about assumptions, prejudice, alcohol, and the difference between commanding respect and earning it." The room fell completely silent as Jake launched into his carefully rehearsed but deeply personal account of that Saturday night at Murphy's Bar. He spared no details about his arrogance, his drinking, or his assault on Admiral Chun. The younger officers listened with growing amazement as their instructor described behavior that would have ended most military careers. "I pushed her because she didn't look like what I thought an admiral should look like," Jake continued, his voice steady but filled with genuine remorse. "I was too drunk and too prejudiced to recognize that I was assaulting one of the most powerful and accomplished officers in the United States military." Jake paused to let the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "Admiral Chun could have ended my career that night with a single phone call. She could have had me court-martialed, imprisoned, and discharged in disgrace. Instead, she chose to teach me a lesson about mercy, justice, and what it really means to be a leader." The story of Admiral Chin's response to the assault had become legendary within military leadership circles. Her decision to offer alternative punishment rather than seek revenge had been studied in leadership courses throughout the military as an example of principled decision-making under pressure. The punishment Admiral Chun recommended was severe but fair, Jake explained. "I was reduced in rank, forfeited pay, lost my prestigious assignment, and underwent mandatory counseling. But more importantly, she challenged me to understand why I had made such serious errors in judgment and to use that understanding to become a better Marine." Captain Sarah Martinez, one of the students in the front row, raised her hand. "Colonel, why do you think Admiral Chin chose to show you mercy instead of seeking maximum punishment?" Jake smiled at the question, which was always asked during these presentations. "Captain, I spent years wondering about that myself. But I eventually learned that Admiral Chun had once received similar mercy early in her own career. A senior officer had looked past her mistakes and seen her potential, and she was paying that gift forward by giving me the same opportunity. But there was something deeper in her decision," Jake continued. "Admiral Chun understood that true leadership means building up the next generation, even when they don't deserve it. She chose education over revenge because she believed that creating one better leader was more valuable than simply punishing one bad Marine." The lecture continued for 2 hours as Jake detailed the lessons he had learned from his punishment and the changes he had made to his character and leadership style. He discussed the bias training program he had developed with Dr. Williams, which had now been implemented throughout the military. He explained how his understanding of unconscious prejudice had made him a better leader of diverse units. Most importantly, Jake shared how Admiral Chin's example had influenced every leadership decision he had made since that night. Her demonstration of restraint under pressure, mercy in the face of provocation, and commitment to long-term development over short-term satisfaction had become the foundation of his own leadership philosophy. During the question and answer period, Major James Thompson asked about Jake's current relationship with Admiral Chun, who had been promoted to Vice Admiral and was now serving as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations. "Sir, do you still maintain contact with Admiral Chun?" "Major Thompson, Admiral Chun, and I correspond occasionally about leadership development initiatives and military education programs. She has continued to serve as an informal mentor, providing guidance on complex leadership challenges. But more importantly, she has become a model for the kind of leader I aspire to be." Jake gestured to a framed photograph on the wall behind him that showed Admiral Chun presenting him with his colonel's eagles during his promotion ceremony 6 months earlier. Admiral Chun attended my promotion to colonel and served as the promoting officer. During the ceremony, she spoke about the importance of giving second chances to those who demonstrate genuine growth and commitment to improvement. The photograph captured a moment that had been deeply meaningful to both officers. For Jake, it represented the completion of a journey from disgrace to redemption. For Admiral Chun, it validated her decision to choose education over punishment 5 years earlier. The most important lesson I learned from Admiral Chun, Jake concluded, is that leadership is not about proving your own superiority or demanding respect through intimidation. Real leadership means creating conditions where others can succeed, even when those others have disappointed you or let you down. After the lecture, Jake was approached by several officers who wanted to discuss specific leadership challenges they were facing. Captain Lisa Rodriguez described a situation where one of her Marines had made a serious error that could have endangered the unit. Colonel Morrison, how do you decide when to show mercy versus when to seek maximum punishment? Jake considered the question carefully before responding. Captain, the key is to evaluate whether the mistake stems from malicious intent or from poor judgment that can be corrected through education and experience. In my case, Admiral Chun correctly assessed that my behavior was driven by ignorance and prejudice rather than genuine malice. But you also need to consider the broader impact, Jake continued. Admiral Chun knew that her response to my assault would be watched by many people and would set a precedent for how senior officers handle similar situations. Her choice to pursue education over revenge sent a message throughout the military about the importance of developing junior leaders rather than simply punishing their failures. Later that evening, Jake returned to his office to prepare for the next day's classes. His desk was covered with student papers, leadership case studies, and correspondence from Marines around the world who had attended his leadership courses. On his bookshelf sat copies of the military leadership texts that Admiral Chun had recommended to him years earlier, now well worn from frequent reference. Jake's phone rang, and he was surprised to see Admiral Chun's number on the caller ID. Despite their ongoing professional relationship, personal calls from her were rare and usually indicated something important. "Good evening, Admiral," Jake answered formally. "Jake, I hope I'm not interrupting your evening," Admiral Chun replied, her voice warm but professional. "I wanted to call because I received some interesting feedback about your leadership course from Admiral Stevens, who attended your presentation last week." Admiral Stevens was the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the highest-ranking officer in Jake's service branch. The fact that he had attended Jake's lecture and discussed it with Admiral Chun suggested that Jake's work was being noticed at the highest levels of military leadership. "Admiral Stevens was very impressed by your presentation and your leadership development programs," Admiral Chun continued. "He specifically mentioned your ability to use personal experience to teach complex leadership concepts in ways that resonate with young officers." Jake felt a surge of pride, but tried to keep his response humble. "Admiral, any success I've had in leadership education is built on the foundation you provided 5 years ago. The lessons you taught me about mercy, justice, and long-term thinking have guided every aspect of my career since then. Jake, I want you to know that watching your growth and development has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my career," Admiral Chun said. "When I made the decision to offer you alternative punishment that night, I hoped you might learn from your mistakes and become a better Marine. But you've exceeded every expectation I had." Admiral Chun paused before continuing with what was clearly the main purpose of her call. "The reason I'm calling is because Admiral Stevens wants to recommend you for selection to Brigadier General. He believes your unique background and leadership expertise make you an ideal candidate for senior command." Jake was stunned by the news. Promotion to general officer rank was the pinnacle of military leadership, achieved by only a tiny percentage of career officers. The fact that he was being considered despite his early disciplinary history was a testament to both his own growth and Admiral Chun's faith in second chances. "Admiral, I'm honored by Admiral Stevens' confidence, Jake replied, his voice reflecting genuine humility. But I want you to know that if I'm selected for promotion, I will continue to carry forward the lessons you taught me about leadership, mercy, and the importance of developing others. Jake, I have no doubt about that, Admiral Chen said. Your work over the past 5 years has demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership the military needs. You've shown that real strength comes from admitting mistakes, learning from them, and using that knowledge to help others grow. After the call ended, Jake sat in his office reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought him to this point. 5 years earlier, he had been a disgraced Marine facing the end of his career. Tonight, he was being considered for promotion to the highest levels of military leadership. But what struck him most was not his own advancement, but the ripple effects of Admiral Chen's decision to show mercy rather than seek revenge. The leadership principles he now taught to hundreds of officers each year had grown directly from that moment of grace in a crowded bar. The bias training programs that had been implemented throughout the military had emerged from his own painful recognition of prejudice and assumption. Most importantly, dozens of young Marines and sailors had benefited from Jake's own commitment to showing mercy to subordinates who made serious mistakes. He had learned to look past immediate errors and focus on long-term potential, just as Admiral Chen had done for him. Jake opened his laptop and began working on a letter to Admiral Chen, something he had been planning for months, but had never found the right words to express. Tonight, with the possibility of his own promotion to general officer, the message finally became clear. Dear Admiral Chen, he wrote, 5 years ago, you made a decision that changed not only my life, but the lives of countless Marines who have learned from your example of principled leadership. Your choice to pursue education over revenge has created a legacy that extends far beyond our individual careers. If I am selected for promotion to general officer, I pledge to continue advancing the leadership principles you demonstrated that night at Murphy's Bar. I will look for potential in those who make mistakes, show mercy to those who don't deserve it, and build up the next generation of leaders rather than simply punishing their failures. Thank you for showing me what real leadership looks like, and for giving me the opportunity to pass those lessons on to others. Jake printed the letter and sealed it in an envelope, planning to deliver it personally during Admiral Chen's next visit to the Command and Staff College. But as he prepared to leave his office, Jake realized that the most important message was not in any letter he could write. The true testament to Admiral Chen's leadership was not Jake's career advancement or the awards he had received. It was the hundreds of Marines who had learned from his courses, the bias training programs being used throughout the military, and the culture change that had begun with one woman's decision to choose grace over revenge in a crowded bar 5 years earlier. Admiral Chen had taught Jake that real leaders create other leaders, and that the most important victories are